everyone, it's Thursday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Rebuilding trust and reigniting global solidarity. Under this theme, President Yoon addressed the UN General Assembly, the annual gathering of leaders from 193 countries. He mainly criticized Russia for its paradoxical actions, waging war and seeking arms from a reclusive regime, violating the UN Security Council resolutions it itself voted for as a permanent member. He underscored how an arms deal between Russia and North Korea would be a provocation against South Korea. Pledging more contributions to reduce global gaps was also included in his speech. What significance does this 78th session of UNGA have, and what are the experts' takeaways from President Yoon's speech? For more on this, we have invited a very special guest into the studio, Revere, Senior Advisor from Albright Stonebridge Group. Mr. Revere is also the former Acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Welcome, Mr. Revere.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's so great to see you in person. Now, first question. Like I said before, at the annual gathering of 193 countries at the UN General Assembly, leaders of 4 out of 5 veto-wielding permanent members of the UNSC were absent. And many experts say that this shows how UN's ability and power have been undermined. Do you agree?
Well, it's no secret that the United Nations organization and the United Nations Security Council in particular have been less effective than they should be, to put it politely. And the reason for that is primarily because of Chinese and Russian opposition and even obstructionism in the Security Council. And at the same time, some people have described the current atmosphere, if you will, in the UN Security Council as dysfunctional.
Right.
I'll refrain from using that word myself, although I understand why people have that judgment when it comes to the Security Council today. On this occasion, as we talk about the number of absences in the General Assembly this year among the P5, so-called P5, Xi Jinping was not there. He has some interesting and challenging things going on at home, and he's not traveling anywhere these days, which is very interesting. So I think that explains in part why he was not there. Vladimir Putin, of course, has an arrest warrant hanging over his head from the World Court and is reluctant to travel to any place that he regards as potentially unfriendly, to put it politely. That doesn't explain why the Brits and the French were not there.
Right.
That was really unfortunate. And so that, in my view, not having those 4 countries at the table sends a really bad message to the international community just at the time when the role in the United Nations is being talked about so much. And just at the time when the array of problems facing the international community are incredibly great. And so this is just not a good way to do business. And hopefully they will do better next year. Right.
Mr. Revere, that being said, calls to reform the UN Security Council is surfacing. And in what ways do you believe the UN should be reformed?
Well, I think there is a need for reform in the United Nations. The system currently is not working. A number of very good proposals have been made over the years that are, I think, worthy of consideration. One of them is to expand the Council and bring in a number of countries that have become major actors on the world stage, whose voices, I think, need to be heard. And that would be one way of expanding the Council, maybe diluting the influence and power of certain countries on the Council. Another way would be to somehow change the voting system. That would get a lot of pushback from the permanent 5.
Right.
My sense is that we ought not to get our hopes up that there's going to be UN reform, unfortunately. I mean, this is an organization that was founded in the aftermath of an earth-shattering war.
Right.
And the structure that it has is the result of that conflict. So it took a major war to bring this structure about. It's going to take a lot more than just calls for reform to get that organization shaped differently, operating differently, and moving into the future in a different manner. So in the meantime, I think the permanent 5 and other members of the Security Council, including Korea, which comes on the Council next year, are going to have to find a way to get along better than the way that they've been following so far.
I see your point. Now, Mr. Revere, let's talk about several highlights of the general debate. U.S. President Joe Biden addressed the UN General Assembly. What was your main takeaway from his speech?
His speech was one of the most forceful and eloquent that I have heard an American president make to that body.
Really?
It was extremely important. He made a powerful case in support of Ukraine, one of the most powerful that he's ever made in support of Ukraine. Beyond that, he underscored the importance of the international community's responsibility for responding forcefully and firmly and clearly and quickly to ongoing Russian aggression. And I thought that was one of the high points of that speech. It was one of the better presentations that he's ever made. But beyond that, I was also deeply impressed by the case that he made for the role of democracy in the world today and the importance of democracy. And the importance of democratic countries working together, pulling together in order to accomplish the big things that need to be accomplished in the world today in light of the range of challenges that the international community is facing. I also thought it interesting, and this goes back to one of your earlier questions, that he actually took an indirect path in criticizing the United Nations. He basically said something along the lines of the United Nations needs to show up and do its job in the current atmosphere. So he called for leadership by the United Nations, and I think that was his way of acknowledging the point you made earlier about the organization is not working, not doing what it's doing. But he also, of course, talked about U.S. leadership being required in the world, and I was very comforted to see him make such a strong case for a strong, committed U.S. leadership in the world today. Certainly, I think the international community needs that, and he made it clear the United States is prepared to provide that.
Right, I see. Now, Mr. Revere, something else that's worthy of talking about is, of course, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskys' address. It was his first in-person address to the Assembly since the Russia waged war. And how did you see his speech overall? It
was powerful, it was direct, and what's another word I could use? Impassioned, to say the least. I actually I only watched 2 speeches from beginning to end. His was one of them. Very powerful stuff, in particularly his emphasis on the potential for Russian aggression to take other forms or to move in different directions in the future. I think the international community needed to listen to that message very closely and carefully, because if you look back at Russian actions in Central Asia and Eastern Europe in the last 15 or 20 years, you've seen a number of instances of the Russians throwing their weight around in very unhelpful and even dangerous ways. And that's what Zelensky was talking about. And he said there's more of that to come, and we need to focus on that. And I think that was an extremely important point to make. I was also very impressed by the arguments that he made, warnings that he issued about the potential for energy and food to be weaponized, if you will, which they are right now being weaponized by Russia and by some of its partners. And that was something I think that was very important for the international community to hear. But it was a great speech, one of the best I've heard.
I see. Now, staying on Zelensky's speech front, he reiterated his call for a global peace summit, right? Where it aims to discuss the peace formula brought up by Kyiv himself. What measures should be in place to make this peace formula by Ukraine become reality?
It takes 2 to make peace, and there's the problem. That's lesson number 1 you learn as a diplomat. If you're going to negotiate the end of something or the beginning of something, you need both sides to be engaged on it. And the problem, of course, is that it's hard to imagine any circumstances under which the Russians would be prepared to give up the territorial and other gains that they've put together as a result of this invasion. And that's the fundamental obstacle that we have here, is that Russia, together with a number of its supporters and partners, including the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, and others, are probably going to be very reluctant. Those other countries will be very reluctant to do anything that could undermine the Russian position. And as long as the Russians know that the Chinese and the North Koreans and the Iranians have their back, it's going to be really hard to get the Russians to come to the table in a serious fashion and negotiate in the context of an international conference on peace, particularly if they know that they're going to be isolated at that conference and will not have the support that they have now with this interesting coterie of other countries that's supporting them. So I would like to be optimistic about this, but unfortunately I'm not.
Right, it's so unfortunate to hear. Now, moving on to President Yoon's speech, Mr. Revere. Last year, he did not directly mention North Korea's nuclear and missile threats, but this year he said Pyongyang's nuclear and missile programs are not just a threat to South Korea, but also to Indo-Pacific region as well. Yeah. Could we say that Yoon administration is no longer interested in bringing Pyongyang back to the negotiating table, given his stern position and his remarks?
I don't know that it's fair to make that criticism of President Yoon and his administration. The offer of dialogue is still on the table. He's made it clear that he's prepared to talk to the North Koreans, but he's also made it clear that he's not interested in dealing with the North Koreans strictly on their terms or strictly on the terms that on which the Republic of Korea used to engage the North Koreans. That's very different from being reluctant to talk to the North Koreans. I keep telling people in my speeches and commentary that if the North Koreans were to ask Seoul for a meeting tomorrow, or to ask Washington for a meeting tomorrow, we would show up for that meeting. We would agree to have that conversation. Now, the conversation would be a very difficult one, a complicated one, but we would come to the table. But the obstacle to dialogue, both North Korea-U.S. dialogue and North Korea-South Korea dialogue, is not Seoul and it's not Washington. It's Pyongyang. It's Pyongyang that is the reluctant player here. And the North Koreans have now made it a point to say that we don't have anything to discuss with you. I mean, that's one of the North Korean talking points. I think even Kim Yo-jong at one point has said something along those lines. What are we going to talk about? We're going to go our own way. We're going down our own path. And we basically have nothing to talk to you about. There is the problem. The problem is not President Yoon's policy or President Biden's policy.
Right, I see. And I cannot agree more. Mr. Revere, since North Korea is showing clear alignment with Russia, I'd like to ask you how South Korea needs to deal with Russia as well. President Yoon already strongly criticized Moscow and warned that if Russia helps North Korea to enhance its weapon programs, that it will consider it as provocations. How do you believe...
direct provocation.
Yes, direct provocation. How do you believe South Korea should deal with Russia as it comes, closer to North Korea right now?
It's important to make clear to the Russians that anything that Russia does that undermines the security of the Republic of Korea, or could undermine the security of the Republic of Korea, is simply unacceptable to the Korean people and to the Korean administration, to the Korean government. It's important that Moscow understand that there will be a price to be paid if it engages in this sort of deal-making with the North Koreans that is rumored to be going on right now. If even half of those things that the North Koreans have apparently put on their shopping list are provided by the Russians to the North Koreans, that has the potential to change the security balance on the Korean Peninsula. It has the potential to undermine the Republic of Korea's security. That is not acceptable, and that's the point that I think needs to be made strongly and repeatedly to the Russians. South Korea and Russia have diplomatic emissaries in each other's capitals. They have an ongoing dialogue. There's an interest in Seoul in keeping the relationship on an even keel and keeping dialogue channels open. And those channels, I think, need to be used and need to be exploited by the Republic of Korea to make those points. And the United States and Japan and other countries can reinforce that message, by the way, with the Russians.
I mean, as you have already said, to make such kind of points, and South Korea already said that it is going to stand with allies and partners, and it is going to not stand ideally by. What measures do you believe Washington, Tokyo, and South Korea could, put in place together?
Well, speaking as a diplomat, the first thing you always do is use your communication channels to convey the bluntest possible message. You follow that up by a public affairs effort in which you make sure that the international community knows what's at stake and what rules are being violated, what red lines are being crossed. But at the end of the day, there are things that the Republic of Korea could do unilaterally or in conjunction with others that could hurt the Russians. And I think that message needs to be made clear to the Russians. For example, the Republic of Korea has a very active relationship with Poland in providing arms and military equipment, K9 howitzers, K2 tanks, and other equipment. Well, it's possible that the South Korean government might have to, if it felt its security was being undermined by Russia, consider changing its policy of not exporting arms to Ukraine. Those weapon systems and some of the others that Korea could possibly provide the Ukraine would really do a lot of damage to Russian security interests. And even the discussion about that in the Korean press, et cetera, about the theoretical possibility that Korea would do that, I think would send a valuable message to Moscow that it is damaging its own interests by seeking to work with North Korea to undermine South Korean security.
So you mean South Korea might have to change its policy of providing lethal weapons to Ukraine through Poland if that's possible?
Well, not necessarily through Poland, although that's an option, but even directly. Once again, the line that might be crossed is that Russia, working with North Korea, is giving North Korea the capability to endanger South Korean security. And if that line is crossed, then we're in a different place. And South Korea needs to make some hard decisions at that point. And it's only South Korea unilaterally that can make that decision.
Right, I see your point. Mr. Revere, we cannot leave out China's position. It seems Russia is going to seek to boost ties with China as well, as Putin accepted Xi's invitation to visit to China in October during the Belt and Road Summit. What are China's views on this Pyongyang-Moscow ties, and what do you believe is going to be discussed during the summit if one takes place?
China's relative silence on the Russia-North Korea summit speaks volumes, quite frankly. They have reported on just a very low-key, very factual basis that it took place, and not much more than that, if you think about it. I think the Chinese are nervous. They're nervous if you think about what the Chinese goals are for the Korean Peninsula. The number one thing on China's list for the Korean Peninsula is stability. No surprises, stability. Remember what happened in 2017 when we thought we might be going to war on the Korean Peninsula? How did the Chinese react to that? Almost in a panic. Started criticizing North Korea, came into the Security Council, started voting for measures against North Korea because they were so concerned about the possibility of chaos on their border with the Korean Peninsula. I think that's probably feeding into their thinking right about now, that if the Russians go ahead with this so-called arms deal with North Korea, along the lines of some of the rumors, that is going to necessitate a response by the Republic of Korea, by the United States. It might even trigger the consultation mechanism in the ROK Japan-US relationship. There will be a response. It'll be a tough response by Korea and the United States, certainly. None of those things are in China's interests. And I think the Chinese may be thinking along those lines right now. I think that the Chinese are also concerned that to the extent that the Russians and the North Koreans grow closer to each other and have a more cooperative relationship, that this has the potential to make North Korea a more independent actor, independent of China, and it has a possible outcome of reducing China's influence in Pyongyang. That's not in China's interest either. So I think those are the things that are on China's mind as it goes forward, including in terms of its meeting with Putin.
Interesting. So because China wants Peninsula to become a buffer zone and to be stabilized, it does not want Pyongyang and Moscow to boost its ties and make Peninsula, the tension on it to heighten, right?
To be fair, I think there is in fact strategic coordination and maybe tactical coordination going on between and among Beijing, Pyongyang, and Moscow, but not to the degree that the Chinese want to allow Russia to take advantage of that cooperation to create the potential for chaos on the Korean Peninsula.
Right, I see. Mr. Revere, I'd like to ask this last question to you. What do you believe South Korea's diplomatic direction to be in this terms of strengthening ties between Moscow, Pyongyang, and Beijing? To
the extent that this becomes a serious partnership with military dimensions and tactical dimensions in a really concrete way, that's not good for South Korea, obviously. It's not good for the United States. And so I think both the United States and the ROK and others in the region are eyeing this carefully. And I think the bottom line position for the Republic of Korea is to repeat a point I made earlier, to make clear that Beijing and Moscow understand that to the extent that that partnership begins to undermine South Korea's security, or has the potential to undermine it, South Korea is required to respond. And the nature of South Korea's response will depend on the nature of the red line that is crossed by that trilateral partnership. I think that's the best response for Korea right now, is to send the clearest possible message to those capitals that it is concerned about where things are going.
All right, send a clear message. All right, I see. I'd like to ask many more questions to our Mr. Revere, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Mr. Revere, for your time and insights. Really appreciate it.
It's been a delight. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.